It began as a whisper in diplomatic corridors, a classified memo never intended to reach the public eye. But what it revealed sent shockwaves through Washington and beyond. A secret document, signed off during the final months of Donald Trump's presidency, detailed a proposed expansion of a visa ban targeting multiple African nations, not because of specific security threat, but due to what the memo called structural incompatibilities with American immigration interests. The language was vague, bureaucratic, but the implications were anything but. If enacted, the policy would have affected millions of African citizens, quietly restricting access to student visas, work permits, and family reunification pathways for entire populations. What made the memo truly explosive wasn't just its content, it was its intent. While the Trump administration had already made headlines with travel restrictions on Muslim-majority countries, this proposed African directive suggested a far broader ambition: to redefine who gets to access America's borders, not based on criminal records or verifiable risks, but on geopolitical calculations, demographic concerns, and cultural assumptions. According to sources familiar with the internal debate, the memo framed African migration as incompatible with long-term national cohesion, citing alleged data on integration difficulties and economic strain, data that many experts have since challenged as selective or outright misleading. The countries named range from major economies like Nigeria and Kenya to smaller states like Sudan and Eritrea. The rationale varied, but the pattern was clear. Africa was being grouped, judged, and potentially excluded as a bloc. The memo's existence was never officially acknowledged. No press release, no public hearing, but its impact was felt through a sudden rise in visa denials, unexplained delays, and procedural hurdles that disproportionately affected African applicants. Embassy officials were tight-lipped. Immigration lawyers were left guessing. Families were separated without explanation. Students missed enrollment deadlines. Entrepreneurs lost contracts. The disruption was quiet but devastating. And yet, the broader public remained largely unaware. The document, circulated among a select group of officials, was marked with restricted clearance. But like many secrets in Washington, it didn't stay buried forever. Whistleblowers, deeply disturbed by the policy's tone and reach, began leaking portions of the memo to investigative journalists. What they exposed was a plan not just to control borders, but to reshape the image of who belongs in America's future. At its core, the memo revealed an ideology of exclusion, one that treated entire nations as risk factors, not individual people. It was, in many ways, the bureaucratic expression of a worldview that had surfaced repeatedly in Trump's rhetoric. One where certain countries were labeled undesirable, and certain populations were seen as burdens rather than assets. And while the memo was never formally enacted as law, its unofficial implementation laid the groundwork for a de facto policy. African nations were being sidelined, silently, systemically, and with little recourse. Diplomats protested, but the administration remained unmoved. Even within the State Department, there was division. Some argued the memo would damage U.S.-Africa relations for a generation. Others claimed it was a necessary recalibration of American priorities. But few could deny the stark message it sent. When it came to immigration, not all continents were being treated equally. This wasn't about security anymore. It was about strategy, about reshaping the demographic future of the United States in line with a political vision that saw diversity not as strength, but as threat. What do you think? Should immigration policy ever be crafted in secret? Can entire nations be fairly judged under blanket policies? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to follow the rest of this uncovered story, subscribe now, because what lies in the next chapters is even more revealing. As the contents of the secret Trump-era memo began to surface, it became clear that this was not an isolated bureaucratic anomaly. It was part of a broader pattern of policy thinking that had been quietly taking root within key sections of the U.S. federal apparatus. The document referenced internal meetings held between senior officials at the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and the Office of the President in early 2020, during which Africa's role in U.S. immigration strategy was openly questioned. According to meeting summaries reviewed by journalists and former officials, concerns were raised not about crime or terrorism, but about assimilation, cultural alignment, and demographic impact. The memo's authors claimed, without definitive evidence, that African immigrants were statistically less likely to integrate into what they termed American civic identity, a vague concept that was never clearly defined, yet used as justification for sweeping proposals. The underlying message was clear. It was not about what African individuals had done, but about what they were perceived to represent. This view echoed language used elsewhere in the Trump administration, rhetoric that painted immigration not as opportunity, but as threat. The visa policy toward Africa was an extension of that logic, cloaked in administrative language, but driven by ideological intent. For many within the African diaspora, the slow, unexplained clampdown on visa approvals had already been noticed. University students who had previously passed all requirements were suddenly placed under additional review. Business travelers faced visa denials without clear explanation. Skilled workers in technology, healthcare, and education sectors, all previously welcomed, began receiving notices of rejection, citing national security discretion. These patterns aligned too closely with the dates and language in the memo to be coincidental. Quietly, a wall was being constructed, not of concrete or steel, but of policy, paperwork, and silence. Advocacy groups began to take notice. Immigrant rights organizations filed FOIA requests, conducted data analysis, and published reports highlighting disproportionate denial rates among African applicants. Still, progress was slow. The lack of an official declaration made the policy difficult to challenge. There was no executive order to contest, no formal regulation to sue. It was a shadow policy, real in effect, but invisible on paper. In Africa itself, reactions were mixed. Some governments issued muted protests, unwilling to jeopardize security or economic cooperation with Washington. Others quietly adjusted their diplomatic engagement, pivoting toward China, the EU, or regional blocs for trade and mobility deals. But for the people most affected, the families divided, the students stuck, the professionals blocked, the damage was personal and immediate. It wasn't just about travel, it was about dignity. About being told, without being told, that your country, your name, your passport was now a liability, that your ambitions were suspicious by default. And as more pieces of the memo leaked, another layer of intent emerged. The policy wasn't just about stopping people from entering, it was about reshaping America's global brand. By limiting African migration, the memo argued, the United States could reduce long-term integration burdens and prioritize culturally compatible applicants. These phrases, carefully chosen, carried deep implications. They suggested a worldview in which nations were sorted into categories of usefulness, a hierarchy of desirability, a filtering of humanity based on origin rather than merit. This wasn't just immigration policy, it was ideology in disguise. And though the memo never reached full implementation before the end of the Trump administration, its legacy lived on, in delays, in rejections, in the quiet normalization of exclusion. Can a nation founded on immigration afford to redefine who belongs based on silent judgments? Should bureaucrats be allowed to shape global relationships behind closed doors? Leave your thoughts below, and if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe to stay with us as we reveal what happened next, because the true scope of this policy is still unfolding. As pressure mounted and fragments of the memo reached journalists, lawmakers, and advocacy groups, a quiet panic took hold within the machinery of U.S. diplomacy. The Trump administration had left office, but the systems it shaped remained intact. Many of the procedures triggered by the memo were still operating on autopilot, visa filters set in motion, embassy directives still active, and immigration officers quietly applying what had once been confidential guidelines. Despite a shift in political leadership, no official rollback was announced. There was no executive order to cancel because there had never been one to begin with. The memo had functioned as an internal doctrine, unspoken but enforced. That made its aftermath particularly dangerous. Without accountability, the system continued to exclude, delay, and frustrate applicants from African nations, now with even less oversight than before. In immigration offices, the language had changed, but the outcomes remained the same. Data analysis conducted by independent watchdogs showed that African visa rejection rates remained disproportionately high into 2021 and 22, even as applications from other regions rebounded after the pandemic. Some nations, like Nigeria and Ethiopia, reported rejection rates upwards of 60% for certain categories of applicants. These weren't just security cases. They included university students, legal spouses, medical workers, and entrepreneurs with verified funding. In each case, the rejection reasons were vague: insufficient ties, unclear purpose of travel, concerns over intent, standard bureaucratic language, yet weaponized to fit an unofficial mandate. This discrepancy triggered alarm in civil society, where legal aid groups, diaspora organizations, and former consular staff began piecing together what had happened. It became clear that the memo wasn't a temporary distortion of policy. It was the blueprint for an informal gatekeeping system, one that bypassed Congress, ignored the courts, and never had to be explained to the public. Meanwhile, the human toll deepened. In Lagos, a family waited over 18 months for a visa ruling on a child's medical emergency. In Nairobi, a scholarship student missed 2 consecutive admission cycles despite full documentation. In Accra, a software engineer with a U.S. job offer saw his application rejected 3 times without clear justification. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic effects of a mindset embedded within the visa process itself, one that saw Africa not as a continent of opportunity, but of risk. While some African governments lodged quiet protests, others felt trapped. They depended on U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing or aid funding and hesitated to confront the issue openly. A few brave ambassadors raised the matter in diplomatic meetings, only to be met with polite indifference or vague promises of review. The silence from Washington was telling. For all its talk of restoring alliances and rebuilding trust, there was no formal investigation into the memo's policy implications. No accountability for the discrimination it had normalized. No apology to the thousands of African citizens whose dreams were quietly denied. Instead, the new administration prioritized other issues, leaving immigration officers to continue applying criteria they had quietly learned during the previous term. And that was perhaps the memo's most enduring legacy. Not the text itself, but the culture it cultivated. A culture of suspicion, a culture of bias, a culture that reduced millions of people to a passport code and an unspoken assumption. As the world moved on, the damage remained, hidden in the data, buried in rejection letters, echoed in the silence of policy reviews that never came. And so the question persists. When exclusion becomes routine, who takes responsibility? Should nations be allowed to re-engineer demographics without democratic debate? What happens when the machinery of immigration is steered not by law, but by ideology? Let us know what you think. And if you believe these hidden policies deserve exposure, subscribe and stay with us. Because in the next chapter, we uncover how this memo affected not only visas, but diplomacy itself. As the memo's logic quietly spread through the visa system, its impact began to leak into other branches of U.S. foreign policy, subtly but unmistakably altering America's diplomatic posture toward Africa. What began as an immigration filtration exercise soon influenced how aid was prioritized, how high-level meetings were scheduled, and even how African nations were ranked in terms of strategic value. Though no official directive ever connected these shifts to the memo, internal communications and embassy protocols suggested alignment with its core assumptions. Certain African leaders were quietly downgraded in diplomatic precedence. Invitations to White House events slowed for nations included on the memo's list. Ambassadors from impacted countries reported less access to top-tier U.S. officials and more frequent delays in bilateral engagement. The message, whether intentional or not, was clear. If your country was flagged in that memo, your seat at the table was less secure. Analysts and career diplomats warned of the long-term consequences. Africa is not a monolith, they argued. It is a continent of 54 nations, thousands of cultures, and rising geopolitical influence. Applying a one-size-fits-all policy of suspicion was not only offensive, it was strategically foolish. Yet, that was exactly what the memo had done. By framing African migration as a structural burden and African institutions as unreliable partners, It had created a perception filter that shaped how decisions were made across departments. Development assistance became more conditional. Military cooperation agreements were quietly reviewed. Investment initiatives were redirected or stalled. In internal memos obtained through leaks, phrases like review alignment with national interest or consider visa incompatibility status began to appear in unrelated policy documents, code language reflecting the same ideology born from that initial classified note. This policy seepage didn't just harm relationships, it created confusion. African diplomats who had long collaborated with U.S. agencies were suddenly met with cold responses, unexplained changes to agreements, and in some cases canceled meetings. At international forums, once routine American engagement became rare. Africa, it seemed, was being placed on hold, not openly, but unmistakably. Meanwhile, rival powers noticed. As America pulled back, China and Russia advanced. Beijing expanded its Belt and Road investments, while Moscow deepened military and energy ties. Even mid-sized powers like Turkey, India, and Brazil intensified African outreach, often citing the West's condescending tone as a reason why new partnerships were welcome. U.S. soft power, once dominant, began to fray. American universities saw a drop in African student enrollment. American businesses reported fewer joint ventures being proposed by African firms. Even public opinion polls across the continent reflected a shift. Trust in the U.S. declined, particularly among youth, who increasingly viewed Washington as hypocritical, preaching equality while practicing exclusion. Within the State Department, some tried to reverse the damage. Quiet efforts were made to rebuild ties, reassure African leaders, and expand people-to-people programs. But the damage was done, because while visas could be denied in silence, their consequences echoed loudly. They sent signals not just to individuals, but to entire governments and populations. And when those signals aligned with subtle diplomatic downgrades, the picture became impossible to ignore. The memo, never formally acknowledged, had shaped America's behavior in ways its authors likely never anticipated. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps the goal was not just to limit migration, but to redefine Africa's role in the American imagination, from partner to problem, from opportunity to obstacle. And if that was the goal, the policy had succeeded, at least temporarily. But what happens when exclusion abroad mirrors division at home? When the ideology of suspicion infects not only who enters your borders, but how you engage the world? Should strategy ever come at the cost of trust? And once that trust is broken, can it truly be repaired? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want to follow how this memo quietly reshaped more than just visas, subscribe now, because the next part reveals how African voices began to fight back. As the effects of the memo rippled across embassies, visa offices, and diplomatic circles, it was only a matter of time before African voices began to respond, not just with protest, but with purpose. What began as quiet outrage among affected individuals turned into organized resistance among civil society, think tanks, diaspora coalitions, and even sitting governments. In Washington, African diplomats began holding closed-door meetings, comparing visa data, sharing experiences, and quietly coordinating statements to press for answers. These were not traditional press conferences or public confrontations. They were calculated diplomatic maneuvers. Letters were sent to the State Department. Questions were raised in bilateral working groups. Data was demanded. But what they received in return was evasive at best. U.S. officials acknowledged that visa rates had shifted, but denied any political motivation. They blamed backlogs, pandemic delays, staffing shortages, everything but policy. Yet the African delegation had seen enough. The patterns were too precise, the timing too convenient, the language too familiar. So the campaign escalated. At the African Union, the issue was placed on informal agendas. Delegates began discussing collective diplomatic pressure. Should African embassies consider reciprocal measures? Should there be a public joint statement? Should high-level engagement with Washington be slowed until clarity was restored? The idea wasn't to sever ties, but to signal resolve. Africa, they argued, was no longer a passive recipient of foreign decisions. It was a rising continent, one whose youth, innovation, and economic power would help shape the 21st century. If the U.S. chose to treat African nations as second-class partners, then it should expect a recalibration in return. At the grassroots level, the pushback was louder. Diaspora organizations held forums, rallies, and media campaigns to draw attention to the memo's influence. Students who had lost scholarships spoke out. Professionals denied entry told their stories. Lawyers filed coordinated legal challenges, demanding transparency. In major cities like Johannesburg, Nairobi, Lagos, and Accra, think tanks published hard-hitting reports connecting the visa data to broader patterns of racialized foreign policy. These reports were picked up by international outlets, sparking debates not only about immigration, but about the deeper structural assumptions embedded in Western African relations. Why, many asked, were African travelers more scrutinized than their European or Asian counterparts? Why did immigration systems assume fraud until innocence was proven? And most importantly, who decided which countries were compatible with America's future? The question struck a nerve. In U.S. universities, students and faculty pushed for more support for African applicants. In Congress, a few progressive lawmakers began asking the administration for internal reviews. While no formal investigation was launched, the pressure was building. The administration could no longer ignore that trust had been breached, and that rebuilding it would take more than apologies. It would require action. Yet many African leaders understood that their true leverage was not in protest, but in principle. They began strengthening intra-African trade, investing in regional mobility agreements, and expanding diplomatic ties beyond the usual powers. In a way, the memo had backfired. By attempting to marginalize African nations, it had accelerated their efforts to stand independently. It pushed the continent to reimagine its own alliances, to look inward and eastward, to explore relationships based on equality rather than conditional access. And that was the irony. What was designed as an exclusionary policy ended up igniting a deeper, more self-aware political awakening. Africa was no longer waiting for access. It was building its own doors. What's your take? Can pushback from African nations truly shift U.S. policy? Or is it time to stop looking westward entirely? Drop your ideas in the comments and subscribe if you believe the future of Africa will be written by Africans themselves. Because in the next part, we explore how this moment fits into a larger global pattern and what it means for the next generation. What made the Trump memo so dangerous was not just the policy it proposed, it was the precedent it set. Once a powerful country like the United States defines an entire region as strategically undesirable, others begin to take note. The ripples do not end at visa counters. They stretch across global diplomacy, multilateral organizations, and public perception. In the years that followed the memo's silent enforcement, other Western nations began quietly adopting similarly restrictive stances, even if unofficially. European countries tightened visa reviews for African applicants, citing vague security concerns. Canada, once considered a haven for African students and professionals, began imposing stricter documentation requirements. Australia increased scrutiny of applications from certain regions. None of these moves referenced the Trump-era memo, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. A chilling consensus was emerging among wealthy nations. That Africa, despite its growth, talent, and global potential, was to be managed, not partnered with. The rationale differed in detail but echoed the same assumptions. Questions of cultural fit, integration challenges, and systemic strain became bureaucratic euphemisms for exclusion. And this shift coincided with a troubling trend in global politics: the rise of nationalism, border hardening, and demographic engineering. In this new world, immigration was no longer framed as enrichment, but as a risk to be calculated and contained. And Africa, with its youth, its energy, its mobility, suddenly found itself recast as a problem in need of a gate, not a partner in need of a bridge. The Trump memo had offered a playbook, one that required no laws, no public votes, no international approval, only the quiet alignment of administrative processes backed by an ideology of managed exclusion. And other governments, watching closely, followed suit. But Africa, too, was watching, and increasingly it was responding. With a rising sense of urgency, African nations accelerated efforts to build continental self-reliance. From the African Continental Free Trade Area to Pan-African University initiatives in visa-free regional mobility zones, the continent was learning the lesson buried in the Trump memo. If you are not welcome, build your own table. This didn't mean turning away from global engagement. It meant entering it on firmer ground. Young Africans, once obsessed with Western degrees and passports, began investing in regional business ventures, digital platforms, and innovation ecosystems. They were no longer asking for inclusion. They were creating alternatives. And that shift, born out of exclusion, began to redefine Africa's global identity. No longer just a source of migrants, Africa was emerging as a source of models on renewable energy, mobile finance, local manufacturing, and youth-led political engagement. The West's rejection, formalized in that secret memo, had sparked something unexpected, a quiet revolution in self-definition. But the deeper question remains. What happens when those locked out of one global system begin to build another? Will the West adjust, reconnect, and recognize its miscalculation? Or will it double down, deepening the divide? The Trump memo may have faded from headlines, but its shadow lingers in embassies, policy rooms, and the minds of millions who were told they do not belong, not because of who they are, but because of where they're from. And in that message lies the true cost, not just to those excluded, but to a world that loses their ideas, their labor, their leadership. Should policy be measured only in numbers or in the lives it shapes? Should a region's future be filtered through suspicion or embraced as a force for change? Tell us what you think, and if you believe that inclusion is a global necessity, not a selective privilege, subscribe now. Because in the next part, we confront the legacy of this policy and what it means for a world already on edge. The legacy of the Trump memo cannot be measured solely in rejected visas or missed flights. It must be understood in the narratives it empowered and the futures it quietly altered. Though it never became official law, its unspoken ideology embedded itself in the systems meant to process, not prejudge. The memo didn't need to pass through Congress to influence policy. It simply needed to shape behavior, to instruct bureaucrats in the language of suspicion, and to align foreign policy with demographic engineering. That is the genius and the danger of such documents. They are not commands. They are templates. And long after the author leaves office, the template often remains. In the years following the Trump administration, the memo spirit lived on in institutional memory. Visa officers trained during that period continued applying restrictive heuristics. Immigration adjudicators who had internalized its logic were still in place, and many African applicants, regardless of qualifications, continued to be subjected to arbitrary denials with no meaningful appeal. More than that, the memo contributed to a shift in public narrative. In media, in political discourse, in everyday conversation, Africa's image subtly shifted from a place of potential to a place of risk. Not overtly, not always with malice, but through omission, through silence, through the steady normalization of absence. Africa was no longer visible in stories of success, innovation, or contribution. It was visible only in crises, in border statistics, in charts labeled threat. And when a region is seen only through its problems, policies toward it are rarely generous. The memo crystallized this logic. It treated Africa as a demographic hazard, not a vibrant continent of 1.4 billion people, but a shadow on the wall of someone else's political ambition. And while the memo never spoke the word race, its conclusions were unmistakably racialized. Entire nations were lumped together, their citizens judged in advance, their value presumed low unless proven otherwise. It was not simply about border control, it was about narrative control. Who gets to be seen as a contributor and who gets filtered out before the conversation begins. Yet, in this exclusion, a new generation was taking note. African youth, hyper-connected, globally aware, politically conscious, understood the message, and they began crafting their own. They took to social media to call out double standards. They launched businesses that served regional markets, rejecting the old dependence on foreign validation. They entered politics, activism, and storytelling with a new purpose, not just to resist, but to redefine. What had been intended as a quiet containment strategy had triggered something louder, more lasting, a refusal to be reduced. Around the world, diaspora communities began organizing. They filed legal challenges, demanded policy reviews, and pushed for new legislation to prevent secret memos from becoming silent laws. Coalitions formed not just to oppose the Trump memo, but to propose an entirely new vision of migration, one rooted in dignity, reciprocity, and reality. Because the truth is simple. People move. Ideas travel. Borders may slow them down, but they do not erase their cause. And policies built on fear only delay the inevitable need for cooperation. What the Trump memo revealed is not just how power can be used, but how easily it can be hidden. And what comes next depends on whether the world is willing to confront that truth. Is the future one of gated nations or connected societies? Will global leadership be defined by control or by courage? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're still with us, subscribe to stay with this story, because the consequences of one secret memo are still echoing louder than ever. As the years passed and the Trump memo faded from active discussion, its presence lingered in the form of silence. There was no public apology, no internal audit, no declassification of its contents. It remained buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, classified markings, and political avoidance. Yet the effects remained etched in the experiences of those it quietly targeted. African families separated by policy gaps, students whose education was rerouted, skilled workers who redirected their futures to countries that welcomed them. These weren't merely logistical disruptions, they were emotional ruptures. And the most painful part? Most of them never even knew why. They followed the rules, met every requirement, passed every interview, only to be told without reason that their application could not be approved. They were not denied by law, but by an invisible filter, a mindset left behind by a memo no one would admit existed. But inside that silence, something else had taken root, a new resolve. African nations began reassessing not just how they interacted with the U.S., but why. What was once seen as the pinnacle of aspiration, entry into the American system, was now being reevaluated. Countries like Ghana, Rwanda, and Kenya began investing in regional higher education, aiming to become knowledge hubs that could retain their own talent. Visa-free policies across ECOWAS and the African Union gained momentum. And across the continent, a psychological shift unfolded, from wanting to leave to wanting to lead. That didn't mean turning away from the world. It meant approaching it with self-worth. The Trump memo, intended to narrow a door, had instead widened a question. Why was African value only recognized when it served someone else's interest? Why did recognition abroad matter more than investment at home? These questions began to shape a generation. Meanwhile, in Washington, administrations changed, rhetoric softened, policies shifted, but none of the new leaders took the political risk of exposing what had been done. There was no incentive. To admit that a secret memo had redefined immigration enforcement without democratic input would have opened too many uncomfortable questions. So the strategy remained the same: ignore, delay, rebrand. But abroad, trust once broken was hard to rebuild. African leaders learned to be cautious. Public diplomacy continued, but private confidence waned. Even the most pro-American administrations began to hedge, strengthening ties with Asia, Latin America, and intra-African coalitions. Some sought dual citizenship agreements elsewhere. Others pushed for regional tech ecosystems, determined not to rely on Silicon Valley for digital progress. The silent logic of the memo, that Africa was a problem to manage, had sparked a loud answer: we will not wait to be chosen. And that answer grew stronger with each example of African excellence. Engineers, writers, scientists, and entrepreneurs continued to break barriers globally, often in systems that tried to shut them out. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could the same people who were denied entry build the technologies, design the cities, and lead the companies shaping tomorrow's world? That contradiction exposed the memo's fatal flaw, not just its prejudice, but its blindness. It assumed that excluding talent would preserve strength. In reality, it only diverted that talent elsewhere. In a world of competition and innovation, exclusion is not power. It is weakness disguised as control. So where does that leave us now? In a global era defined by climate crises, health emergencies, and digital revolutions, no region can afford to ignore the potential of another, and no country, however powerful, can afford to silence the voices it once dismissed. What began as a hidden memo has become a global case study in unintended consequences. And the next part of that story is still being written by the very people it tried to block. What would you say to the leaders who approved that policy? What message should African youth send back? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for the final part, where we explore how the world must now decide between closing its borders or opening its mind. What the Trump memo ultimately revealed was not just a policy flaw, but a philosophical crisis, one that still hangs over the world today. In its quiet attempt to redraw the lines of belonging, it forced a question that global powers can no longer avoid. Who gets to define value in a connected world? Can borders truly secure prosperity, or do they merely delay the need for justice? The memo tried to engineer exclusion through silence, to reshape America's future without public debate, to decide behind closed doors which nations were worthy and which were not. But in doing so, it exposed the fragility of systems built on fear rather than cooperation. It showed how easily ideology can slip into law when accountability is absent. And most of all, it showed that no nation, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of its choices. The backlash to the memo wasn't just diplomatic, it was generational. Across Africa and its diaspora, a new wave of thinkers, builders, and leaders emerged, not in reaction to America's rejection, but in defiance of its assumptions. They chose to rise anyway. They launched startups that solved local problems. They created media that told their own stories. They studied and built and returned home, not because they were denied, but because they saw something bigger, the chance to create something on their own terms. In doing so, they didn't just reject the memo's logic. They made it irrelevant, because while a secret policy tried to shut them out, they were already opening new worlds elsewhere. In a time when global collaboration is more vital than ever, when pandemics, climate change, and economic shocks transcend nationality, the idea of filtering humanity by origin is not just outdated, it is dangerous. The Trump memo was not merely about African visas. It was about the kind of world we choose to build, one where fear governs opportunity, or one where trust enables growth, one where walls define our politics, or one where bridges define our legacy. That choice does not belong to presidents alone. It belongs to all of us. To challenge silence with truth, to meet exclusion with excellence, to answer rejection with resilience. Because the final chapter of this story is not in a memo, it is in the millions of lives that refuse to be measured by it. If you followed this journey to the end, ask yourself, what kind of world do we want to create from here? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in telling the stories others try to bury, subscribe, because the truth will not stay silent, and neither should we.